The gap between the partition and the wall was suffocatingly small, a calculated error in my own office design. I could smell the faint, metallic scent of the server exhaust vents, a sharp contrast to the sterile lemon polish the cleaning crew left behind. My leg cramped, a sharp protest against the indignity of this position. I adjusted my stance, silk rustling against drywall. This merger was worth $50 million, but the cost of failure was incalculable. It was my reputation on the line. I needed to know if the shy genius I'd hired was a savior or a saboteur. Then, the electronic lock beeped. Control is not a preference. It is an architecture. I built my career the way I built this headquarters. Steel spines, transparent glass, and absolute, unflinching visibility. I don't tolerate shadows. I don't tolerate ambiguity. When you sit at the head of the table, you learn that silence is a weapon and eye contact is a contract. If you can't hold my gaze, you can't hold my trust. That was the rule. That was the foundation. And Hazel was the tremor in the ground I couldn't predict. She was a brilliant anomaly in my carefully curated world. As the lead consultant on our security infrastructure, she navigated complex code like she was breathing. But navigating a conversation seemed to physically pain her. In board meetings, while others postured and preened, Hazel shrank. She sat with her shoulders hunched, her eyes tracking the movement of dust motes rather than the faces of the investors. When I asked her a direct question, she would answer the air to her left, her fingers constantly working, twisting a silver ring, tapping a rhythm on her notebook, smoothing the fabric of her pants, until I wanted to reach out and still her hands myself. It was a constant, low-level vibration that set my own teeth on edge. To my board, she was eccentric. To me, she was the only internal variable with enough access to cause the recent data leak. She stayed late, arrived early, and avoided eye contact. The narrative wrote itself, the quiet technician selling secrets. I interpreted her need for sensory regulation as the fidgeting of a liar. So, I built a trap. I announced a fake trip to Singapore. I left the Project Chimera files, the crown jewels of the merger, sitting on my desk, a chaotic pile of paper bait. I dismissed the security detail for the floor. Then, instead of heading to the airport, I slipped back into the office, wedged myself into the dark corner behind the decorative partition, and waited. It was a calculated cruelty. I wanted proof. I wanted the satisfaction of confirming my cynical worldview, that everyone, even the quiet ones, eventually betrays you. The waiting was agony. The office, usually a hum of activity, was a tomb of silence. I watched the shadows lengthen across the floor, the city lights outside turning into blurred streaks of rain against the glass. I felt foolish, crouching in the dark in a $2,000 suit, spying on an employee. But the stakes demanded precision. If she took the files, I would destroy her career before morning. If she logged into the terminal, I had the police on speed dial. I was ready for war. I wasn't ready for the door to open. The sound of the latch disengaging was loud in the stillness. I held my breath, my heart hammering a traitorous rhythm against my ribs. The heavy oak door pushed inward, and the hallway light spilled in, catching the silhouette of a woman standing on the threshold. She didn't move like a thief. She didn't scan the room with the sharp, hungry eyes of a spy. She stood there, hesitating, holding the doorframe as if testing the air pressure of the room. I watched through the narrow slats of the blind, my judgment locked and loaded. I expected her to rush to the desk. I expected the frantic rifling of papers. I expected the crime. I tightened my grip on my phone, ready to record the evidence of her betrayal. I was the architect of this moment, the master of this domain. I was absolutely certain of what I was about to see. I was wrong. Hazel didn't prowl. That was my first mistake. My first miscalculation in a night that would become a catalog of them. She didn't move with the furtive, jerky energy of someone about to commit a corporate felony. Once the latch clicked home, sealing her inside the sanctuary of my office, the tension that usually held her body in a tight, defensive knot simply evaporated. It was jarring to witness. In meetings, she held herself like she was anticipating a blow. Shoulders up, chin down, arms crossed as a barrier against the world. Here, in the perceived safety of solitude, she unfolded. Her spine lengthened, her head tilted back, exposing the vulnerable line of her throat to the ceiling, and she exhaled a long, shuddering breath that I could hear from my hiding spot 10 feet away. The sensory landscape of the room shifted with her presence. The sterile, recycled air of the HVAC system was suddenly cut through with the scent of the city rain clinging to her trench coat. Wet wool, ozone, and something softer, like vanilla or old paper. It was a human smell, messy and real, invading the hermetically sealed perfection of my workspace. I pressed my eye to the slat of the partition, my heart rate spiking. This was it, the moment the mask slipped. I watched her hands, expecting them to reach for a flash drive or a camera. I waited for the betrayal. Instead, Hazel began to move in a way I had never seen in a boardroom. She didn't approach the desk. She walked to the center of the open floor space and began to pace, not anxiously, but rhythmically. She shook her hands out at her sides, a rapid, fluttering motion that looked like she was trying to fling water from her fingertips. It was a stim, a self-regulatory behavior I'd read about in HR manuals, but never witnessed with such unguarded intensity. She was shaking off the sensory overload of the day, regulating her nervous system in the only place she felt safe. It wasn't the behavior of a spy. It was the behavior of someone who had been holding her breath for 8 hours straight. She stopped abruptly and turned toward my desk. My grip on the wall tightened. The Project Chimera files were right there, a chaotic white stack screaming to be stolen. Hazel approached them. She reached out, her fingers hovering over the confidential stamp. I prepared to burst out, to catch her red-handed, but her hand drifted past the files. She picked up a fountain pen I had discarded in frustration hours earlier. She capped it with a precise, audible click. Then she picked up another. She wasn't stealing. She was organizing. With a tenderness that made my chest ache, she began to bring order to the chaos I lived in. She aligned my scattered pens perfectly parallel to the blotter. She stacked the loose correspondence by size. She moved my forgotten, half-empty coffee mug to a coaster, wiping the ring it left behind with the sleeve of her own expensive coat. It was an act of intimate, unasked-for service. She was soothing the room. Then she did something that shattered me completely. She placed her hands on the back of my leather executive chair, leaning down until her face was level with the empty headrest. "You're making it too hard on yourself," she whispered. The sound of her voice, low and husky in the quiet room, felt like a physical touch. She wasn't talking to herself. She was talking to the ghost of me. "You don't have to carry the whole sky, you know. It's okay to put it down. I wish you'd let me help you. I wish you weren't so lonely." I stopped breathing. The accusation of theft, the paranoia, the elaborate trap, it all crumbled into ash in my mouth. I wasn't the hunter catching a predator. I was a voyeur, witnessing a confession of care I didn't deserve. She didn't want my company's secrets. She saw the cracks in my armor that I thought were invisible. She saw the exhaustion I hid behind 7-figure deals. The guilt hit me with the force of a physical blow, heavy and suffocating. I had weaponized her shyness, criminalized her neurodivergence, and in return, she was asking the empty air for permission to comfort me. Hazel lingered for a moment longer, her hand resting on the chair as if grounding herself against my absence. Then she pulled away. She checked the alignment of the pens one last time, a final benediction of order, and turned to the door. When she left, the silence that rushed back in wasn't empty anymore. It was charged, heavy with the terrifying realization that the person I trusted least was the only one who truly knew me. The morning sun sliced through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the boardroom with the subtlety of a diamond cutter. It was a cold, aggressive light, designed to expose flaws in contracts and weaknesses in people. Usually, I thrived in this illumination. It was the spotlight I had built my empire under. But today, sitting at the head of the 20-foot mahogany table, I felt exposed. My skin felt too tight, my senses dialed up too high. I was operating on 2 incompatible frequencies: the ruthless CEO who needed to close a merger, and the woman who was still hauntingly aware of the ghost of a touch on her empty chair. I looked down the length of the table. The board members were sharks in Italian wool, smelling the blood in the water that the recent data leak had spilled. They were restless, clicking pens and checking watches, hungry for a scapegoat. And at the far end, standing by the projector screen, was Hazel. The transformation was heartbreaking. The woman who had moved with such fluid, rhythmic grace in the privacy of my office was gone. In her place was the consultant I had misjudged for months. She was encased in a gray blazer that seemed to swallow her whole, her shoulders drawn up toward her ears as if anticipating a physical blow. She wasn't looking at anyone. Her eyes were fixed on the carpet, and her hand was clutching the presentation clicker so hard her knuckles were white. I could see the tremor from 20 feet away. It wasn't guilt. I knew that now. It was the sheer, crushing weight of being perceived by people who refused to understand her language. "Begin," I said. My voice sounded foreign to my own ears, too sharp, too commanding. I wanted to soften it, but the room demanded the performance. Hazel started speaking. Her voice was quiet, a low hum that forced the men in the room to lean in, invading her space even from a distance. She knew the data. Her analysis of the security breach was flawless, a symphony of logic and code that should have silenced any doubt. But she wasn't performing the confidence they bought. She was delivering the truth they feared. "The internal nodes," she stammered, her rhythm breaking as a heavy truck rumbled on the street below. She flinched at the noise, a micro-expression of pain that no one else caught. She lost her place. "The nodes. The architecture suggests a localized—" "Speak up," interrupted distinctively abrasive board member Marcus. He didn't just speak, he barked. "And look at us when you're explaining why we lost proprietary data. Eye contact is basic respect, isn't it?" The air in the room snapped tight. Hazel froze. I saw her breathing hitch, a rapid, shallow panic taking hold. The fluorescent lights overhead seemed to buzz louder, a swarm of angry hornets. She was spiraling into sensory overwhelm, right there in front of the people who held her career in their hands. Marcus leaned back, a smug smirk playing on his lips, satisfied that he had exposed the weak link. I felt a surge of protective rage so hot it almost burned my throat. "Stop," I said. I didn't shout. I didn't have to. The word dropped into the room like a lead weight. Marcus turned to me, eyebrows raised in expectation of my support. He expected me to finish the kill. "The lighting in here is interrogational," I said, my voice smooth, cool, and utterly absolute. I stood up and walked to the wall panel, sliding the dimmer down until the harsh glare softened into a twilight calm. And the acoustics are terrible for rapid-fire questioning. It's inefficient. I turned my gaze on Marcus, unflinching and cold. "If you have questions, write them down. We will address them at the end. I want to hear the data, not the sound of your voice interrupting the expert I hired." The silence that followed was absolute. I had never defended a contractor. I had never altered the environment for anyone's comfort. I saw the confusion ripple through the board, but I didn't care. I looked at Hazel. For the first time in our professional history, she didn't look at my chin or my ear or the wall behind me. She looked straight into my eyes. The connection was a physical shock, a sudden, high-voltage current arching between us across the length of the table. Her eyes were dark, intelligent, and wide with a dawning realization. She saw what I had done. She understood that I wasn't just managing the meeting. I was building a shelter around her. The panic in her posture bled away, replaced by a sudden, steadying gravity. She nodded, a tiny, almost imperceptible movement, and then she turned back to the screen. She finished the presentation without a single stutter. When the meeting adjourned, the room cleared quickly, the board members eager to escape the strange, heavy tension that had settled over the room. Hazel packed her laptop with efficient, jerky movements, clearly intending to flee before the reality of what happened could catch up to her. She moved toward the door, head down, retreating back into her invisibility. I couldn't let her go. Not yet. "Hazel," I said, staying seated, my hand resting flat on the cool wood of the table. She stopped in the doorway, her hand on the frame. a mirror image of how she had stood the night before. She didn't turn around immediately. I saw her take a breath, preparing herself for the reprimand, for the reversion to the status quo. "Wait," I commanded, but I let the order soften into something that sounded dangerously like a request. "Close the door." The latch clicked shut, sealing us in. But the air in the room didn't settle. It vibrated. Hazel stood with her back to the wood, her eyes wide, waiting for the axe to fall. She expected a reprimand for her performance, or perhaps a firing for the embarrassment. She didn't know that I was still reeling from the image of her hand on my empty chair, organizing my chaos. I needed to keep her close, but I couldn't tell her why. I couldn't tell her that I had been the phantom in the room with her the night before. So I did what I always do when emotions threaten to breach the perimeter. I manufactured a crisis. "The anomaly in the server logs," I said, lying with the smooth, practiced ease of a woman who negotiates for a living. I picked up my coat, signaling that the discussion was moving, not ending. "You were right to stumble. It's not localized. I suspect the breach might be deeper than the board realizes. I need you to walk me through the raw data, line by line. But not here." I gestured vaguely at the glass walls, the illusion of transparency I had once prized, now feeling like exposure. Somewhere with less noise. Hazel blinked, the tension in her shoulders unlocking just a fraction. It was a reprieve. It was work. She understood work. "I can pull the logs on my tablet," she said, her voice steadying. "Good. My driver is downstairs." The ride to the Lower East Side was a study in heavy, pressurized silence. My town car was a capsule of leather and rain-streaked glass, moving through the city like a shark through dark water. Hazel sat on the far side of the bench seat, pressing herself against the door as if trying to merge with the upholstery. She stared out at the blurring lights of the city, her reflection in the window ghostly and pale. I watched her profile, fighting the urge to speak, to explain, to apologize. But the partition was up, and the silence felt necessary. It wasn't empty. It was thick with the unasked questions hanging between us. She was wondering why the CEO who terrified her was suddenly sheltering her. I was wondering how I had gone years without noticing the quiet grace she carried. I chose the archives for a reason. It wasn't a place for power lunches or loud posturing. It was a subterranean lounge lined with heavy velvet drapes and sound-dampening acoustic panels, designed for privacy and low tones. It was dark, serious, and sensory-friendly. I saw Hazel's reaction the moment we stepped out of the car. She braced herself for the assault of a crowd, for the noise. But as we descended the stairs, the city's roar faded into a muted, respectful hush. The entrance was narrow, a bottleneck of patrons waiting for tables. Without thinking, or perhaps thinking too much, I moved to guide her through the crush. I reached out and placed my hand on the small of her back. The contact was electric. It wasn't a professional tap. My palm pressed flat against the wool of her coat, feeling the heat of her body beneath the layers. It was a claim. It was a steer. For a second, she went rigid, her breath hitching audibly. I expected her to pull away, to shrink from the touch. But she didn't. She leaned back, just an inch, unconsciously seeking the pressure, the grounding weight of my hand. The crowd parted, and I kept my hand there a moment longer than necessary, guiding her into the shadows of a corner booth. The heat of that contact lingered on my palm like a brand. We ordered drinks, a whiskey neat for me, sparkling water with lime for her. She arranged the condensation rings on the table into a perfect Venn diagram, while I pretended to review the data on her tablet. But the numbers blurred. The silence wasn't empty. It was thick with the unasked questions hanging between us. She was wondering why the CEO who terrified her was suddenly sheltering her. I was wondering how I had gone years without noticing the quiet grace she carried. The air in the booth became suddenly too thin, too hot. I was drowning in the intimacy of it. I needed air. We pushed out of the heavy oak doors and into the cool shock of the night. The air outside was sharp, tasting of ozone and wet pavement. The rain had reduced to a fine silver mist that hung in the air like a suspended breath. We walked without a destination. It was a silent agreement to delay the inevitable separation, to keep the night alive for just a few blocks more. The sidewalk was slick and black, reflecting the chaotic energy of the city. But between us, the silence had shifted. It wasn't the terrified silence of a subordinate, nor the commanding silence of a CEO. It was the companionable, heavy silence of two people who have just recognized a shared frequency. We walked closer now, our shoulders brushing occasionally as we navigated the evening rush. We reached a crosswalk just as the signal turned to a solid, unforgiving red hand. We stopped at the curb, the sudden halt bringing our bodies into a dangerous proximity. I could feel the heat radiating from her, a palpable warmth against the damp chill of the night. My hand hung at my side, inches from hers. As the crowd pressed in behind us, waiting for the light, the space evaporated. The back of her hand brushed against mine. It was a glancing contact, fleeting and light, but it sent a shockwave straight up my arm that settled heavy in my chest. Neither of us pulled away. The friction of skin on skin, amplified by the cold air, became the only thing in the world. I looked down. Her fingers were twitching slightly, not in anxiety this time, but in reaction. She was aware of it. She was allowing it. The tension shifted violently from intellectual curiosity to something undeniably, terrifyingly physical. The air thickened, charged with the sudden realization that the asset beside me was a woman I wanted to touch with precision and intent. The light changed to white. The crowd surged. We didn't move. "I have to tell you something," I said, my voice dropping low, fighting the noise of the city. The secret of the night before, the foundation of this entire shift, felt suddenly corrosive. I couldn't build this, whatever this was, on a lie. "I wasn't in Singapore last night, Hazel. I didn't fly out." She turned to me, the neon sign of a nearby bodega painting her face in shifting hues of blue and red. Her brow furrowed, the calculation running behind her eyes. "Then where were you?" "I was in the office," I said, the words falling like stones. "I was hiding behind the partition. I was testing you." The rain began to fall harder, drumming a frantic rhythm against the awnings, sealing us into the confession. The rain didn't give her time to process the betrayal. The skies opened up with a sudden, violent intensity that turned the street into a drowning pool, making any further conversation impossible. I didn't wait for her permission. I signaled my driver, who had been circling the block like a shark in the downpour, and ushered her into the dry silence of the car. The drive to my building was short, a blur of wet asphalt and tension thick enough to choke on. I didn't take her back to the office. I didn't take her to a hotel. I took her home. My penthouse is the crown jewel of the skyline, a glass box suspended 40 stories above the chaos of Manhattan. It is impressive, expensive, and desolate. As Hazel stepped out of the private elevator, I saw it through her eyes. No photographs on the white marble walls, no throw pillows on the Italian leather, no clutter, no life. It was a showroom for an existence I didn't actually live. Hazel didn't admire the view. She walked to the bookshelf, touching the spine of a first edition that had never been cracked open. "It's quiet," she said. It wasn't a compliment. It was a diagnosis. "It's controlled," I corrected, walking to the bar cart. I poured 2 ambers, skipping the ice. "I need you to understand. The test. It wasn't personal. It was protocol." Hazel turned to look at me fully. She didn't look angry. She looked disappointed. "You didn't think I was a thief because of my behavior," she said, her voice steady. "You thought I was a thief because you can't imagine a world where someone doesn't want something from you. You built a trap to prove to yourself that everyone is guilty, because if I stole those files, it confirms that you're right to be alone." The truth of it sliced through my defenses. She had dismantled my entire psychological architecture in 3 sentences. "I was wrong," I whispered. "I watched you organize my desk. I heard what you said to the empty chair. I was prepared for betrayal, and you gave me care." Hazel watched me for a long moment. She took a step closer. "You don't have to do anything with it," she said softly. "You just have to stop testing me." The power dynamic that had defined us, boss and consultant, payer and payee, evaporated. We were just 2 women standing in a cold room, stripping away the layers of protection we both wore. I walked toward her, extending the glass of whiskey. My hand, usually steady enough to sign billion-dollar contracts without a tremor, was shaking. The amber liquid rippled in the glass, a betrayal of my own nerves. Hazel looked at my hand. She saw the tremor. She didn't comment on it. She simply reached out and took the glass, her fingers brushing against mine, warm and grounding. She took a sip, her eyes never leaving my face. "Thank you," she said. We moved to the sofa, the white leather vast and imposing. I sat on one end, she sat on the other, a safe distance of 3 feet between us. But the air had changed. The accusation was gone, replaced by a tentative, fragile truce. I watched her take another sip, the whiskey warming her, flushing her pale cheeks. The silence wasn't heavy anymore. It was waiting, and imperceptibly, without either of us moving a muscle, the distance between us began to close. The silence that filled the penthouse wasn't the cold, sterile void I preserved like a museum exhibit anymore. It was alive, heavy and humid, pressing against the glass walls like the storm raging outside. I stared down into my whiskey, watching the amber liquid tremble because my hands refused to be still. I am a woman who signs $50 million mergers without blinking. Yet sitting 3 feet from Hazel on a white leather sofa, I felt like I was vibrating apart. The air between us thickened, charged with that undeniable pull, gravity shifting its axis, tilting the entire room toward her. I wanted to move closer. I was terrified to move closer. Hazel set her glass down on the coaster. The click of glass on marble was the loudest sound in the world. She didn't ask for permission. She didn't flinch or retreat into her usual protective shell. She shifted on the leather, closing the gap between us, and reached out. Her hand settled on my shoulder. It wasn't a tentative tap or a polite gesture of sympathy. It was a firm, grounding weight. Through the thin silk of my blouse, her palm felt like a brand, searing and impossibly warm. My first instinct was to stiffen, to armor up, to reject the intrusion with a sharp look or a cold word. That's what the architect does. The architect stands alone. But the heat of her hand seeped into the knot of tension at the base of my neck, and for the first time in 20 years, the armor didn't just crack, it evaporated. I let out a breath I felt like I'd been holding since the shareholder meeting in 2018. My head dropped forward, just an inch, leaning involuntarily into her touch. It was a surrender. The shaking in my hand stopped, replaced by a sudden, overwhelming heaviness. "You're so tense," she whispered. Her voice was right there, close to my ear, low and stripped of all the corporate noise. "You're holding on so tight. You can let go." "I don't know how," I admitted. The confession scraped my throat, raw and honest. Hazel didn't offer a solution. She offered herself. She moved her hand from my shoulder to the back of my neck, her fingers threading into the hair at the nape, and guided me. I turned toward her, and the remaining distance collapsed. My arms found their way around her waist, burying themselves in the soft wool of her sweater. Her arms came around me, locking across my back, pulling me in until there was no air left between us. It wasn't sexual, not yet. It was structural. She was holding me together. The sensation was drowning and rescuing all at once. I could feel the steady, rhythmic thrum of her heart against my chest, beating a counterpoint to my own frantic pulse. I could smell the rain on her skin, the faint vanilla of her shampoo, the clean, honest scent of her. For a CEO who lived in a world of abstract numbers and projected outcomes, this was shocking in its reality. The texture of her sweater under my cheek, the solid resistance of her ribcage, the sound of our synchronized breathing in the quiet room. "I've got you," she murmured into my hair. "It's okay. I've got you." I closed my eyes, burning with the sudden sting of tears I refused to shed. This was it. This was the hunger I had been starving from while feasting on power. I had money, influence, fear, respect. But I didn't have this. I didn't have the simple, devastating weight of another human being holding me without asking for a return on investment. I realized then that my test had been a farce. I hadn't been testing her loyalty. I had been desperately searching for someone who could withstand my intensity long enough to hold me. The embrace deepened, and the comfort began to shift. The hand on my back slid lower, pressing me closer. My grip on her waist tightened, bunching the fabric. The desperate need for comfort was rapidly bleeding into a desperate need for something else. I pulled back just enough to look at her, my face inches from hers. Her eyes were dark, dilated, searching mine. The shy client was gone. In her place was a woman who knew exactly what she was holding. I looked at Hazel, really looked at her. And the woman who couldn't make eye contact in a boardroom was staring at me with a gaze so direct, it felt like she was reading my source code. There was no fear there anymore. There was no hesitation. There was only a terrifying, silent question. And she was waiting for me to answer it. My hand moved from her waist, sliding up the curve of her spine, feeling the tension in her muscles. Not the rigid anxiety of the office, but the coiled, ready energy of anticipation. I reached her neck, my thumb resting against the frantic, hammering pulse point just below her jaw. The air between us was so charged it felt physical. I could smell the rain drying on her skin, mixed with the faint, metallic tang of the city, and the expensive oak moss of my own perfume clinging to her from the hug. She tilted her head, just a fraction. It was an invitation. It was a dare. I am a woman who calculates risk for a living. I run probabilities, I forecast outcomes. But in that moment, the math failed. There was only the heat radiating from her skin and the sudden, desperate need to close the gap. I leaned in. The first brush of our lips was tentative, a testing of the waters. It was soft, almost accidental, like a question whispered in the dark. But then Hazel made a sound, a low, broken inhale that vibrated against my mouth, and the hesitation shattered. She pressed forward, her hands tangling in the hair at the nape of my neck, pulling me closer with a strength I didn't know she possessed. The kiss wasn't just physical. It was architectural. It had weight. It had texture. It was the taste of the whiskey we'd shared, oak and fire, mixed with the salt of the night air. It was a collision of two people who had been circling each other in the dark for months. I felt the precise shape of her mouth, the softness of her lower lip, the sudden, demanding pressure as she deepened the contact. It wasn't the polite, sterilized affection of the social circles I moved in. It was raw. It was messy. It was real. My hands were everywhere, in her damp hair, gripping her shoulders, sliding down to pull her hips flush against mine on the leather sofa. The professional boundaries we had maintained, the hierarchy of CEO and client, the careful walls of the office, they didn't just fall. They were incinerated. I wasn't her boss. I was just a woman starving for this specific friction. I felt her teeth graze my lip, a sharp spark of pain that only fed the fire. I felt the desperate, seeking movement of her tongue, the way she tasted like rain and want. We broke apart for a second, gasping for air, our foreheads resting against each other. Her eyes were closed, her lips swollen and red, her chest heaving against mine. I watched a drop of water from her wet hair trace a line down her temple, catching the light. I wanted to consume her. I wanted to be consumed. "Hazel," I whispered, my voice wrecked. She didn't speak. She just opened her eyes, dark, unflinching, possessive, and pulled me back in. This time, there was no hesitation. The kiss was a claim. It was a merger of the only assets that actually mattered: breath, skin, heat. I lost track of time. I lost track of the storm outside. There was only the sensation of her hands on me, the taste of her mouth, and the terrifying realization that I had spent my life building an empire of glass when I should have been looking for this warmth. The night dissolved into a blur of touch and sensation, the city below us forgotten, until the darkness finally began to gray into the quiet promise of dawn. The morning protocol usually involves a triple shot of bitter espresso, a ruthless review of the Asian markets, and a freezing cold shower to sharpen the jagged edges of my personality. It is a ritual of armoring up, a daily reconstruction of the fortress before I face the world. But today, the light filtering through the penthouse blinds wasn't an interrogation lamp. It was soft, diffuse, turning the austere white walls into something actually habitable. I woke up alone in the bed, the high thread count sheets cold on the other side. And for a terrifying second, the old reflex kicked in. The suspicion that she had run, that the vulnerability of the night had been a strategic error she was already regretting. I pulled on my silk robe, tying the sash tight like a combat belt, and walked out to the kitchen, preparing my defenses. Hazel hadn't run. She was sitting on the marble island, wearing one of my white dress shirts that engulfed her small frame, her bare legs swinging in a rhythmic, happy pendulum motion. She wasn't hiding in a shadow. She was center stage. She held a mug of coffee with both hands, tapping her fingertips against the ceramic in a fast, light cadence, a stim that I now recognize not as anxiety, but as pure contentment. The smell of the coffee was different, richer, brewed in the French press I never had the patience to use. I stopped in the doorway, just watching her. My test was over. I wasn't looking for leaks or lies anymore. I was cataloging the way the morning sun caught the dust motes dancing around her, realizing that my sterile apartment had finally become a home, simply because she was breathing in it. She looked up, and the smile she gave me was unguarded, free of the corporate mask she wore like a shield. "I disabled the alarm," she said, her voice raspy with sleep, but steady. "It was going to go off at 6. I thought we could use the quiet." "You hacked my alarm clock?" I asked, moving toward her, the tension leaving my shoulders. "I reconfigured the user preferences," she corrected, her eyes dancing. "Your morning protocol is too aggressive. It spikes cortisol levels unnecessarily." I stood between her knees, resting my hands on the cool marble on either side of her. "And what do you propose as an alternative protocol?" "Coffee," she said, lifting the mug to my lips. "And maybe acknowledging that the data leak wasn't in the server. It was in you. You were leaking loneliness, Victoria. It was a massive security risk." I took a sip, the coffee hot and strong. But her use of my first name was the real shock to the system. It stripped away the title, the salary, the power dynamic. "We have a board meeting at 9, I said, though the words felt heavy, irrelevant. "We have to go back to the glass fortress. We have to pretend this, us, doesn't exist." Hazel stopped swinging her legs. She hooked her ankles behind me, locking me in place. "I can pretend," she said, her expression turning serious, the brilliant consultant resurfacing. "I can wear the blazer. I can look at the floor. But I need to know that when the door closes, you're not going to test me again. I need to know the surveillance is off." "The surveillance is off," I promised, running my hand down the curve of her spine, feeling the warmth of her through the cotton of my shirt. "No more tests, just data. And the data says, I don't want to be in that boardroom without you." "We have to go," she whispered, though she didn't move to let me go. "Marcus is waiting for the report." "Let him wait." I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. The screen was full of notifications. Urgent emails, schedule reminders, the relentless demand of the empire I built. I looked at Hazel, at the messy hair and the borrowed shirt, and the quiet, steady truth of her presence. I unlocked the phone. I opened my calendar, and with a single, deliberate swipe, I cleared the entire morning block. "Meeting canceled," I said, tossing the phone onto the sofa cushions where it couldn't disturb us. "Emergency infrastructure maintenance." Hazel laughed, a bright, clear sound that filled the empty space of the penthouse. "Is that what we're calling it?" "I'm the CEO," I said, leaning in to kiss the corner of her mouth. "I define the terminology." We walked into the office building 2 hours later. To the receptionist and the board, nothing had changed. I was the ice queen in the $3,000 suit. She was the quiet shadow trailing behind. But as we stepped into the elevator, the steel doors closing to seal us in, her pinky finger hooked secretly, deliberately around mine. The test was a failure, but the result was a victory I never saw coming. If you want to see what happens when you stop testing people and start trusting the connection, subscribe to the channel.